Welcome back to PS Weekly, the sound of the New York City school system. I'm Bernie Carmona.
I'm Isabella Mason.
New York City is home to about 1 million public school students, making it the largest student population in the country.
But New York City is also among the most segregated school systems in the nation, and that's in a city filled with students from every corner of the world.
And then there's the current political climate. Today, Isabella and I will discuss the state of ethnic studies in New York City schools and how recent political debates are shaping those conversations. So Isabella, you've had some experience with ethnic studies yourself. Can you tell me what that's like?
It's been a really great experience taking this class now in my senior year of high school. So not only does AP African American Studies allow me to see different parts of American history that haven't been taught in your regular U.S. history class, but it also teaches the contributions and impact African Americans have had on American art, literature, or music, and activism. An example being the Black Panther Party and their contributions in the Black campus movement and actually establishing the first ethnic studies college in America.
Right. That's so interesting, the first ethnic studies college in the United States. That's actually something we learned a lot about in our ethnic studies class.
Yeah, it's really important to know where these classes come from because without the Black Panther Party and the Black campus movement, we wouldn't have ethnic studies today. This actually makes me wonder what other voices and histories we aren't hearing. Recently, ethnic studies programs have faced significant opposition in states like Florida, Arizona, and California. Even right here in New York, where ethnic studies has seen some growth, there are concerns about how political pressure could impact future progress.
Well, let's backtrack to before the political pressures on DEI curriculums were even as intense as they are now. Back in 2020, Marame Diop was at Beacon High School.
It was sophomore year, and I was in Miss Rubin's, I think it was world history, right? That's what you take sophomore year? It was during COVID, and the assignment was something about, like, if you had to create your own class, what would it be?
Marame's answer was an ethnic studies class. Her teacher loved the idea and got their principal on board.
She was like, oh, like, she really was inspired by what I wrote in my project, and she was like, you know, in college, I studied ethnic studies, and, like, what you said and how, like, you want to teach history kind of models that same pedagogies of, like, CRT, critical race theory. And then so she was like, you know, I could really help you, you know, create your vision and you know, make it come to life. And I was just so excited because I feel like when you create a project or you submit something in a history class, it's just like a dream. It's like a fantasy. It's like it never really comes into fruition. But having a teacher that actually like believed in you and like believed in your project and wanted to see it through was like really inspiring, because obviously it's a big project and it took my full junior year. It was just really all hands on deck and just, you know, after school meetings literally almost every single day, and also just have so many other students resonate with the class and actually like appreciate their histories being taught in the class rather than just sitting through a boring 50-minute lecture on some old white dead guy, if you know what I mean.
Marame is now a sophomore at Yale University, connecting her interest in sociology to the foundation of ethnic studies. And actually, I now co-facilitate the same class she originally created at Beacon High School. But I wanted to understand how her interest in ethnic studies began.
Can you just describe what a typical history class at Beacon looked like for you? So what classes were available and what would you describe that as?
Freshman year, sophomore year, I think we just took like the regular core curriculum classes. So it was like world history, I think. And then US history, I know, was 11th grade. Yeah, I feel like past history classes at Beacon, it was like cool, but I feel like ethnic studies did more than what the core, like the common curriculum, like offered.
Wait, Bernie, what is this course?
So the course at Beacon High School is basically centered around the impacts of racial injustices. And at Beacon High School specifically, the class is made up of 2 units. In the first unit, we mainly center it around community building, in the sense that we have discussions about our cultural and or racial identities. We usually start the class off in a circle and end it in a circle. And at the end of that unit, students do a podcasting project where they're paired up with a random student of the class, and they're required to create an hour-long podcast about their cultural identities.
That's super cool. Wait, that's actually really cool.
And then we have Unit 2, which is mostly centered around learning about those actual racial injustices. Unit 2 consists of mostly learning about case studies, watching documentaries about the history of racial injustice and the creation of ethnic studies, and basically learning about student activism, where we can eventually create a final project, which is an advocacy letter or an op-ed newspaper to any news source that you would like to send it to.
That is so cool. I wish my school had that, actually.
Yeah, it's really fun. We have a lot of students come back the next year saying, we missed this class and we want to be back.
Do you think that the course should be mandatory for all students in New York City, or?
Absolutely. I think it should replace one of our history courses, definitely, because I just know so many students are just lacking in education, and they're just carrying on these biases throughout the world. And when they get into positions of power, what do? They abuse it. They don't understand why DI is necessary. They don't understand that the structures, that racism isn't just a social construct. It's in systems that perpetuate such harmful inequalities and negativities. And if they don't understand how these structures are still in place today, what can they do in their position of power to change the world? Look at our administration right now. Trump went through the entire catalog. He recalled documents that had the word gay in it because of DEI, because he wants to get rid of DEI. I think that is absolutely insane when we let people like that, who don't understand the structures and the true history of this country, and it's just so heartbreaking.
That was Marame Diop, a former student at Beacon High School and a current sophomore at Yale. What started as an idea turned into a course that reshaped how students learn about U.S. history, but also how we learn about ourselves. Her story is what reminds co-facilitators like me to do more than just check boxes and read slides off a screen, but actually discuss the voices of students that built and continue carrying its legacy forward.
But it's exactly courses like these that are at risk across the country. Nearly 800 high schools across 40 states teach AP African American Studies, another ethnic studies course created by the College Board. And those are the courses the Trump administration considers divisive.
Well, the topics in question, according to the president, are race, sex, gender, and politics. He's ordered the Secretary of Education to create a strategy within 90 days to stop these teachings in the classroom.
Coming up, we'll talk with Chalkbeat reporter Julian Shen-Berro about the broader political challenges facing ethnic studies. That's after the break.
Hey listeners, it's Amy Zimmer with Chalkbeat New York. We hope you're enjoying this season's first episode of PS Weekly, and we've got an assignment for you. Follow us on Instagram at Bell Voices. Please tell your friends about us, share it with your teachers. We'd love for social studies, civics, and advisory teachers across the city to bring PS Weekly into your classrooms. And we want to hear from you. Email us at psweekly@chalkbeat.org.
Welcome back to PS Weekly, and Isabella and I are discussing the ethnic studies curriculums.
Yeah, Bernie and I were discussing how important ethnic studies was to us, and we would like to see ethnic studies be a mandatory part of curriculum in New York City high schools. But it's those classes that the federal administration is trying to get rid of. So, we spoke with Chalkbeat reporter Julian Shen-Berro about how likely it is that the classes we value will be taken away.
Yeah, I'm a reporter at Chalkbeat, so I cover New York City news, New York City schools, K through 12 education, and mostly the public school system.
Okay, so before this current administration, how would you characterize the state of ethnic studies within New York City school system?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different efforts kind of ongoing to try to improve that, from educators, from elected officials. We've seen there's a Black Studies curriculum, K through 12, that rolled out in New York City in recent years. I believe it's in about 200 schools now. And, there is the Hidden Voices curriculum that the city's education department developed to try to uplift stories from marginalized communities that, might be overlooked in other curriculums. I think there are, elements of this that don't always reach every student. Something like Hidden Voices was designed so that teachers could, choose to bring parts of it into the classroom. It's not like a course itself, but it's offering materials to educators to try to bring them in. So obviously that requires the teacher to go out, seek it out and to bring it into their classroom. The Black Studies curriculum, is optional for schools. They don't have to teach it. And so, again, not every school is going to have access to that. And so I have encountered students who feel like they haven't seen themselves represented in the curriculum. And that does continue to be an issue, here and everywhere. But there are strides that are being taken, and there's a clear goal of trying to improve that issue here.
So I know you've covered the DEI policies in New York City recently. So how has that knowledge really guided you throughout this process and writing the story?
Yeah, I think obviously the use of the term DEI and diversity, equity, and inclusion has sort of become very politicized. But I think, we've seen from, various people here in New York City that they've been kind of affirming their commitment to diversity in classrooms and in other spaces. The Attorney General put out guidance recently sort of pushing back on what the federal government has been, vocally saying about, possible action they'll take if schools or other institutions are changing their, are continuing to use policies that they see as sort of DEI. My understanding there has been traditionally that term has more been about kind of hiring practices, has been about, thinking about like teacher workforce in the schools and less about the curriculums. But it does seem to be kind of expanding and broadening to encompass more and more.
Okay, to go off of that question, I read in your article, Trump can't ban DEI in schools. New York Attorney General affirms in new guidance that the Attorney General stands ready to enforce their state's robust civil rights protections, and in which in many cases exceed federal civil rights protections wherever discrimination may be found. So can you speak a little bit more on this and how New York City public schools are protected from the whims of the presidential politics?
Right. I think some of the concern there was that they were going to go after schools that might have, for example, a program that is focused on college and career readiness for students of color or something like that, or particularly highlighting certain student groups that might have faced historical challenges and like trying to better their outcomes in the education system. That's something that the Trump administration has maybe would see as kind of DEI and go after. And so what the Attorney General was saying is those practices remain legal and schools shouldn't shy away from continuing to do them. So that's kind of one part of answering that question. And I think the other element of this is that the federal government doesn't have authority to dictate what is taught in the classroom. States do decide sort of the learning standards for their states, the requirements for what's taught in the schools. And so that isn't an authority that the federal government has directly. But what they do have is a lot of funding that goes to New York City schools and other schools here in the state. And so I believe it's about $2.2 billion in the education department budget, which is coming from the federal government. It's about 5%. So it's not, the main source of funding by any means. Again, there are debates there if he has that power. Congress is supposed to be the one with power over the purse. But we have to kind of see how all this is going to play out in the court system. So there are some unknowns there.
Okay, how much of this concern do you think is realistic or warranted?
I mean, these kinds of things are not new, right? These, we've seen attacks on like the LGBTQ community. We've seen efforts to restrict how, racism is taught in history classes and in other spaces, going back years now. And so I think the concerns I've heard from people who work in these spaces is sort of twofold. One, that people who are already sort of have been making these attacks on certain populations are going to feel emboldened to continue to do that. I think the other element that I've heard some concern about is whether we could see some kind of self-censorship if people are kind of going to comply in advance with some of these things out of fear of facing some kind of backlash.
Have you seen any real-life impacts of Trump's initiatives against DEI as a journalist?
Yeah, I think we're seeing definitely changes in the way that people are willing to like publicly talk about some of these things. For example, we saw in the city council, they postponed a hearing that they had planned to talk to the city's education department about its efforts to reduce segregation in the school system. They postponed that hearing out of concerns about whether it could open the school system up to some kind of targeting by the Trump administration. I think we've also seen organizations make smaller changes sort of publicly. I've heard of organizations that have changed their name to remove kind of references to certain communities or groups that the Trump administration has targeted with these executive orders out of fear, again, of like drawing that kind of public eye and then drawing backlash. I think from what I've been hearing so far, people are still trying to make sure that the work they're doing internally stays the same, that they're still giving kids the same access to these kind of resources that they've been providing in communities. But we have to see just how far the administration is willing to go in terms of trying to enforce some of these executive orders here in New York City. And we'll see if there's kind of any continued fallout.
Yeah, that's really scary. Like the fact that they postponed that simply just to not put a spotlight on it, I think it's really insane. So in the end, what do you think the future holds?
I think it's worth noting, even before Trump's election and, even before any of these recent executive orders, there have been pushes, at Beacon and other places to increase the amount of access students have to ethnic studies. I know at the state level, there's been an effort to create a curriculum for, Asian American Pacific Islander history. There have been various efforts ongoing for years to try to increase access to diverse curriculums in schools. And those have, borne out some benefits and some kind of concrete changes as a result. But in other ways, it's still kind of a work in progress. And so I think that regardless of what happens with the Trump administration, students are going to continue advocating for these curriculums because they're things that they've expressed they want in the classroom. And lawmakers or education officials who care about these issues are probably going to continue to advocate for them as well. So we might see, more divisive rhetoric around this. We might see the Trump administration trying to tamp down on some of these efforts. But I would be surprised if New York City students and educators didn't continue to advocate for them, just based on the conversations I've had and what I've seen from students and educators here.
Thank you, Julian.
Yeah, of course.
That was Julian Shen-Berro, a Chalkbeat reporter, and you've been listening to the first episode of Season 2 of PS Weekly.
PS Weekly is a collaboration between The Bell and Chalkbeat, made possible by generous support from the Pinkerton Foundation, the Summerfield Foundation, and FJC.
Producers for this episode were me, Isabella Mason,
and me, Bernie Carmona, with reporting help from Chalkbeat reporter Julian Shen-Berro.
Our executive producer for the show is Ave Carrillo, and executive editors are Amy Zimmer and Taylor McGraw.
Additional production and reporting support was provided by Mira Gordon, Sabrina Dekeni, and our friends at Chalkbeat. Our engagement editor is Carolina Hidalgo.
This episode was made using Hindenburg Pro. Music is from Blue Dot Sessions, and the jingle you heard at the beginning of this episode was created by the one and only Erica Huang.
Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.